Are you ready, Tim? Should we get
I
going?
am, yes.
All right, so hey, welcome everybody to our Illuminate series. This is our kickoff webinar for the series, and as many of you know, we were hoping to have you, many of you, up to St. John's for our conference, and obviously COVID has made that impossible. And so, like all of you, we've had to make adjustments. I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items, and then I want to get out of the way because I want you to have access to Tim. First of all, we are recording this, so we will make this available for those of you colleagues who missed the webinar. So we'll make that available to you, and I'll be getting back in touch with you about how to access that. Secondly, while there's a short sort of presentation part that Tim will begin with, you'll notice on the bottom of your screen, we're not going to use chat. We're going to use the QA function, and I'm going to be the QA sort of filter screener, if you will. I'm going to go off video, and I'll be looking at the QA, and I'm going to be sort of picking out those questions that I think are really applicable to the most of you that are out there, and then I'll be posing them to Tim at different points during the webinar. So that's kind of how we're going to do it, and we're going to learn as we go here a little bit, and then finally, I just want to thank Tim. Many of you are already familiar with Tim because he's presented at your locations, and he did a phenomenal job. If you haven't had a chance to see his presentation at Wayzata Community Church, which he did last Friday, that was our first time doing it in the COVID era, and it really went very, very well. And the feedback we got from the attendees that were there was great. So I really appreciate Tim's work on this, and then also all the work he's done over the many years. He's worked on the St. John's Bible. He's obviously our go-to person. And I've been in meetings with Donald Jackson and Tim where someone will ask Donald Jackson a question and he will turn to Tim and say, "Oh, Tim, what do we do here?" And so you're in good hands today. So I'm gonna go off screen. I'm gonna turn it over to Tim now, and then I'm gonna be checking out your questions. Please don't be shy. Please pose your questions because we do wanna get them answered in the next, we're going to go 45 minutes to an hour on this webinar. So thank you very much. And Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all of your guests, and to see so many enthusiastic people willing to give up a nice afternoon. Well, hopefully it's nice where you are, and learn more about sharing the St. John's Bible. It has been my privilege for the past, 17 years now to be the curator or the keeper of the pages and the keeper of the story for this thing, as I always say, we call the St. John's Bible. And I don't know if I have the most knowledge, or it can be always the go-to, but I can without any question say that I have probably presented on the St. John's Bible more than any other person associated with the project or in the world. And that's what today is about. Today is about helping you as people who have the St. John's Bible find ways to share it effectively. So today is not the story about the St. John's Bible. I'm not going to give you new details about the quills or the inks or even some illuminations. But our goal today is to simply have a conversation about effective ways to share the St. John's Bible. And that's what that video experience was about. And what I'm going to share today is not just the way to share it, or even the best way to share it. What I'm going to share with you today is how I engage people with the St. John's Bible. And please do ask questions, give comments, give feedback about the things that I'm going to share, and maybe some ideas that you have as well. But I'd like you to look at this conversation in kind of two ways. Look at what I'm offering to do as ideas, but also think about what is the role that you play and that you saw me play in the video. What did I physically do to engage people or to encourage people to discuss, even though that was a very truncated experience that was on the video. And so our goal today, once again, is to give you some methods, tools, and just to really have a conversation about how we can go about sharing this thing called the St. John's Bible. One of the most common questions I get when I'm doing the St. John's Bible is, what if they stop talking? And people get so afraid of silence. The biggest advice I can give to anyone who's sharing this is don't be afraid of silence. Don't be afraid to ask a question and wait. Just sit there and wait. Give people time to think. There's nothing wrong with that. So many times I have been in a presentation or watching someone present, and they'll ask a question, and within 1 second, they've looked around and they start answering it themselves because they're so afraid of that dead air. There's nothing wrong with wait. And if you look at the video that we put together, I do a lot of waiting. I do a lot of just letting it sink in. And also I do a lot of listening as well. And that's a very important thing. But one of the common questions that I do get when I am working with the St. John's Bible and people who are presenters is they ask me, you should be able to see my screen now. They ask me, or they panic, let's see here, when this happens. My audience is stalled. So I'm going to start this afternoon with giving you some techniques and things that I use when I'm working with an audience, and maybe the audience hasn't stalled, or maybe I just need to redirect energy, or need to redirect the focus or conversation, or maybe someone's talking too much. I need to find a way to get my group back together. But there are some certain things that I like to do. And again, these are not best practices or even sound practices. These are just things that I do as a natural kind of part of my teaching. And I do look at every presentation I give kind of as a teaching moment, or as a facilitating moment, or a way of engagement as well. So let's say you have the illumination of the St. John's Bible from creation, everyone's favorite one. And you're looking at that, and all of a sudden, you know, the conversation has kind of stalled. People, when they look at an artwork, almost always your audience will talk about an artwork as a collective whole in a way. Here's a very good example. In this one, almost everyone talks about this particular artwork from here over this way. In almost every instance, with the exception of some traditions, people will start talking about the St. John's or the creation story, and they unpack it this way. Well, you get to a point and your audience has talked about this, they've stalled. What if you simply reverse the viewing? So take a look at what your audience has just said. There's a slight stall, and say, now, you've been unpacking this artwork this way. What happens if we reverse it and unpack it this way? And talk about it from right to left, as opposed to left to right, or top to bottom, or bottom to top. Just simply change their focus. In a simple switch like that, reverse the viewing, can easily, dramatically change your conversation. Another example, here's another one where people always read it like this, or they read it in slices like this, almost always leading over here to this image of Christ. What if in your conversation you simply change that and you say, now you've been looking at this artwork this way. What if we started the artwork here? And our conversation begins here with this gold figure of Christ. What happens if we look at it from his point down this way? And it might take some pause and some thought, but you'll see how it will dramatically change the conversation that you have. Another good example, when I show this one, people always start the Valley of the Dry Bones. Of course, their eyes immediately go down here and they start unpacking and saying, what is all this dead stuff and all this kind of good stuff? Once again, what if you just changed it and said, what if our conversation begins up here? And so by finding ways to simply redirect the conversation, so take a conversation you've already had and just reverse it. You'll be surprised at what it leads to and all the different technique or different conversations and words that pull out. And of course, your job is to be listening to that whole time. So you've reversed the conversation. You're now looking at another artwork. So here is the Paul Anthology. You've talked about this over and over. Your audience has now stopped talking, or maybe they didn't talk at all. Know your artwork and just simply say, well, you know, you're looking at this artwork as a whole, but what if we narrowed in right here? What are his hands doing? And then you can start leading that discussion, helping them out. Narrow in on a particular detail that allows the viewer to get into a different part of the artwork as opposed to seeing the whole thing. And that's just a really simple thing to do. Another fun technique that I use when I'm sharing with an audience, I may have the books in front of me, or I might have it projected on the back. So many of us will say, okay, here is the illumination for Valley of the Dry Bones, whatever it would be, let's unpack it together. Well, one little technique that's kind of fun to do is to have a big sheet of paper or something close by if you're working with a book, or have it set up beforehand, or you could do it on the screen. You simply say, I'm going to show you one of the illuminations in the St. John's Bible. You set it up like you would normally do. However, you show it to them like this. I call this a partial reveal. So you show them the St. John's Bible, you have this artwork and you say, oh, this is called Valley of the Dry Bones. Here's what it led to. What's back here? So give them part of the illumination. Hold a discussion, even just talk about all this up here. Talk about the gold, the light, the color, the rainbows, what that might mean theologically, and so on and so on. But then say, now, of course, what's missing? What's the part that we have down here? What would you put down in that area there? And those things really allow the viewer to have some comfort and freedom, because no one knows what's down there. Maybe some have seen it before. But so there's that freedom of anything is possible. But it also, you've given them something on which to hang their hat right up here and say, what if this is what's up here, what's down here? So, and again, you can do it digitally, you can do it with the volumes in front of you, all kinds of different little techniques as well. So those are just three very simple methods that I use if my audience is stalled a little bit, or if I need to re-energize something, or even just to lead a discussion. Another thing is simply, you know what, show them an artwork and say to them, you know, what would you title this work? What would you call this work? And of course, you can't show what that is. You can see here I have the title blacked out. You can put it up a little bit later on if you want to. But asking them to retitle the work, or even if they know the title, can you suggest any other titles and things like that? Another technique, or another little question you can use, is to actually have them make sure that they're part of that artwork. So you've had a conversation. The conversation has been kind of stalled a little bit. You simply ask that question. If you were seated here, what would you see? What would you hear? Where would your eyes go if you were seated here? If you were seated here, if you were seated here, or any, it doesn't have to be, you know, such a literal artwork. People are, this is one, raising of Lazarus. What would you see if you were standing here facing Lazarus inside the tomb? What would you see if you were behind Lazarus? What would you see if you were outside? Or just basically ask them to put themselves in that illumination. It begins to change the conversation and dramatically changes how they start to interact with it. Listening carefully to your audience is very important. And I will often tuck in the back of my head a comment or a word or a phrase that an audience member has said. And I will bring that back repeatedly throughout the conversation. So let's say in a conversation about the creation story, someone talked about the fact that it is good, or it is chaotic, or it is prophetic. So I might say, you know what? We just looked at, you know, this work. What is prophetic about this? Could we apply, you know, Mary's word prophetic to this? And could we unpack that word? What does prophetic mean? Could we unpack the word chaos? Would the word chaos apply to this? Or another idea that somebody has brought out. Pick up a word, bring it back, because that will, number one, tell your audience, of course, that you're listening to them and that what they're saying is very valuable as well. So remember to go back to what your audience has said, because it's their conversation that's important, not yours. If your audience is stalled, change the physical state of the audience. I will often, in the middle of a big audience, if I have a group of 50 people, I will simply say, everyone stand up, turn to the person behind you or next to you or something like that, and answer this question. Or I will say, everyone stand up and, you know, go to someone else in front of you, or cross the room. If it depends on how your room is set up, of course. But it can be simply something as simple as standing up to answer this question and sit down. Change the physical state of your audience, and you will be amazed at how dramatically that changes the interaction and energy that happens within an audience. Answer a question standing up dramatically changes everything. Another idea, if I've got an audience, I do this a lot when I have teenagers or even grade school kids, or even seniors that are senior citizens that are not willing to do a lot of talking, and they simply want me to tell them the stories. I tell them a couple of stories of a few illuminations, and if I have 7 books open in front of me, I'll say, okay, it's time for you to do some work. And I will say, we've got 12 people, 4 of you go over here and look at this illumination. 4 of you look at this illumination, and 4 of you look at this illumination. Have a conversation amongst yourself, and I'm going to leave and come back and talk to you about it later on. And by getting yourself out of that and forcing them into this conversation, it may end up they do just a conversation about what they see and about what they point out. But the point is, they are now left with this conversation, and the responsibility for the conversation is theirs. And then, of course, afterwards, you say, let's come back. Let's hear what these people have to say about this artwork. And you can have a conversation about, you know, the Word became flesh, and they can say, well, we saw in this, or in this one here, and so on. Again, just dividing and conquering. You getting out of the picture and stopping talking for a while, and then that presenter mode changes the dynamic of the room, and you'd be amazed at how new leaders and new discussers come from there as well. And finally, a fun little thing that I like to do, and especially when I have college age students, is to play What's on Your Phone? They love to do this one, especially when I've got a college age group of students, or even high schoolers that are being as passive as they can love to be at certain times. I'll have an artwork on the screen or whatever. We've talked about it, or we've done some element of it, and I'll say, I bet all of you have music on your phone. Does this artwork remind any of you of a piece of music on your phone? Play it for us. And you'd be amazed if they go, this is pretty cool. They start looking through their phone and stuff like this. Or you all take pictures with your phone. Is there any picture on your phone that you could say relates to the artwork you have in front of you? Or a scripture passage. Is any picture in your phone remind you of these words, that type of thing? So one of their favorite tools and favorite toys is this thing. Find ways to bring it into the conversation. And again, it will dramatically change what you did, because number one, you've acknowledged the fact that you have a younger audience, or an audience that loves this, but you've acknowledged the fact that what they have, what they deal with, and what's very important to them might have a relationship to this. The whole point of this is find ways to connect with the audience in which you give up the control of, let me tell you the story. And that's really key with all of this. So that's my first little bit. Excuse me, I got a little tickle in my throat.
Hey, Tim, while you get your voice, Jenny Kniff has a question, and the question is, thank you very much for the video. It was very helpful. I'd like to know what tips you have for folks who have responsibility for sharing the St. John's Bible with the public, but who are not experts on the Bible. I am a special collections library, and I have much to learn, as we all do.
Very good. Thank you very much for your question. And I started my life for 16 years as an elementary 5th and 6th grade classroom teacher. I do not hold a manuscript degree. I do not hold a theology degree. I do not hold an art history degree. I have a master's in education. And as you can probably guess, I can sit in my dining room and talk to my lamp over here and have a very good time. What you need to be willing to do is to get rid of that mentality that you are the expert. If you listen to my video, a word that you heard me say over and over and over again is that this is communal. This is about the communal nature of the word. It's about sharing. And if we want the Bible to be around for the next 500 years or 2,000 years, we have to find ways of making the communal nature of the word a reality. But that being said, we all have responsibility. I can talk about the St. John's Bible with a hot pen because I've studied it, and I have done as much reading and exploring and talking to people as I possibly can. There's some great books out there. You can get information on the St. John's Bible from those books, but the best possible way is simply opening a book and asking people, what strikes you? What do you see? And have that conversation. Engage with them in that conversation, and you'll be amazed at what you have to share. And you're a librarian, so bring in the history of books and knowledge. As I said in the video, 85% or only 14% or so of the Bible is pictures. 85% of it is just beautifully handwritten pages. The history of the book, the history of the story of writing, the skill of a calligrapher's page is a great topic that can be brought through as well. I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm not a theologian. I don't pretend to be a theologian. And those techniques I just showed you, you don't need to do anything, have any other skill, but being willing to listen, to have wait time and be comfortable with silence, and be willing to engage people in conversation.
Tim, that's great. The other thing I would add too, and this is especially true with when I present the St. John's Bible, and that is there's usually some pretty good expertise in the audience. And
Yeah.
I continue to learn from my audience in terms of maybe an insight of the Bible that I wasn't up to speed on. I'm by no means a biblical scholar. So
Mhm.
the audience is very helpful. Hey, just a reminder, everybody, we're not using the chat function. We're using the QA function at the bottom. So if you have questions, please let us know. Maureen Crawford, our good friend, has a question, says, thank you. There's nothing like being in the presence of the Bible, touching them, seeing the light reflect off the pages, understanding the size of the books. This is obviously the challenge in today's world. I've created a day-long experience with the St. John's Bible for deacons in my diocese, and I am not worried about them engaging. I am just wondering how to make the most of the visual part of the experience. And I will be presenting a little, having my participants discuss often in small groups, and I'll be using PowerPoints. But how do you make the most of the visual part of the experience?
Well, the entire project is visual, number one. Just even if you have all 7 volumes, I don't know your situation, but if you have all 7 volumes, walking into a space with all 7 volumes displayed, as Donald Jackson talked about, as if they're open peacocks, that right there takes advantage of the visual experience as well. Many congregations use the St. John's Bible to do readings, and they'll bring in the volume that they're going to read. In my bias, anytime the St. John's Bible is used in liturgy and where you're going to have a reading from the gospel, all 7 volumes should be brought in, not just the one you're using. Think of the visual power of the word in its large format coming into the church, and all 7 volumes are there. And maybe during the reading of the gospel book is taken into the middle of the congregation. It is opened and read and held by somebody, but then at the same time, the other 6 volumes are held up around the congregation. And so you have the visual experience of the word being surrounded by the people, and the people surrounding the word becoming one.
Hey, Tim, Maureen qualified her question, and she just typed in, the challenge now is how do you do this in the virtual world, right? You don't have the physicality of the book, which is the same problem we have, right? So
yeah, I've been doing virtual programs since March 12th, almost nonstop. So I've done over 40 of them. And look at my screen when I shared those images. I have them right there. I do a lot of my presenting with images on the screen and getting people to look into the details of an artwork and having conversations and comparing them not only with the St. John's Bible artworks, but with other artworks in history, other artworks from famous collections. You know, if you're going to talk about the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, start with Albrecht Dührer's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. That's available readily online, or any other 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and take a look at how it was done, and then take a look at what was done with the St. John's Bible. Finding ways to visually share the St. John's Bible is actually very easy in the digital world because it is so visual, and you can put it up on the screen. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
no, that's great.
But take a look at how I have my slides formatted when I show some to you again in a few minutes.
Tim, the next question comes from David Crawford down in Creighton. David, his question is, social distancing and cleaning protocols required at our institutions are bringing some new challenges for presenting the Heritage Edition. Any suggestions on what we should or shouldn't be doing regarding people touching the volumes, cleaning it after folks leave, et cetera? Any alternative ways to promote the communal experience when people can't really stand shoulder to shoulder?
Yeah. Again, in this day and age, I'll have the book with me if I'm in our auditorium in the days past. I would have the book with me and on display on the plinth or wherever I'm standing. And then as I turn the page here, I would show the image behind me on the screen. So they can't all gather around this book, but you have the book with you and people understand what you're doing. Turn the page, here's what you're looking at. I'll show it to you behind me in much large format on the screen. Don't not have the book if you can, but find a way to kind of pair both the visual image, the digital image, and the book itself as well. What I do a lot of times when I have groups and things is I bring out the trade editions. We have several copies of the small versions of the St. John's Bible, the coffee table book, for lack of a better word. And I'll have the Heritage Edition, or I'll be in the gallery with the real thing, and I'll have 10 copies of Pentateuch or something like that. Or if I only have one set, I have all 7 of those out and ask them to have those, and they can be shared closely. Remember that physical things and the chance of catching something from a physical touching of a thing is less than through the air. So it's more important that you have physical distance between people as well, as opposed to being afraid of having them touch things as well. And, you know, it's wonderful to see the volumes all spread out in front of you, but spread them around the room. I mean, when I do this now, I have a volume in that corner, a volume over here, and a volume over here, and a volume over here, physically distancing them as well.
If you, the recommendations that we also received was Purell seemed to be the one that got the most votes for the purest cleaner. You just have to have some paper towels with the Purell to get the Purell off your fingers, because especially with kids, they get a little bit overly aggressive with the Purell.
Exactly. Yeah. And especially with Purell or with hand sanitizers that have moisturizing, those will have an element that can leave a stain on paper. So just keep that in mind.
Thomas Ray down in St. Louis, a good friend of the program. Thank you for your presentation. At our cathedral, we only have one volume open at a time, and we do have drop-in visitors. Some say, some stay while you're talking, others kind of come and go. And if you stop and repeat something you just said to the new people that come up, all of a sudden you lose the people that were kind of hanging there. This is a challenge, right? Because you're trying to be hospitable and, oh, you know, they're new, and then all of a sudden people hear you repeat it. And yeah, how do you handle that, Tim?
Yeah. I always start at the beginning of the book and start paging through and talk about a page of text as well as I talk about a page with illumination. The saddest thing I always see is when I go into a church or a place and they have all the illuminations marked and they open only to those pages. And you are giving up, you know, 80% of your content or 80% of the book. But basically, you know, I have that all the time. I will stand with a group and people will wander through and wander up and back and forth. I just start at the beginning of the book and I start paging and going all the way through. If there's a story that I really want to tell again, I'll get there eventually when I go back to the beginning. But this is about engaging with this as a book. And you're going to have people that are going to hear the same stories twice. If you only have one volume out at a time, that's going to be a challenge you're going to have. But just page through it. And again, the conversation can be different if you do less of the talking and you simply say, what do you see here? What strikes you with this page? What would you title this? Remember we talked about this one before? How does it relate to this one? So as opposed to being so worried about telling the stories, because as long as you focus on telling the stories and telling people what the artwork is about, then it always will remain your book. You've got to find a way, I work on finding a way to bring people into the conversation through questioning.
Great.
Then the conversation is always different.
Another question comes from Julie Moberly. Tim, when introducing an audience to the St. John's Bible via PowerPoint, what are the most important or critical elements of the story? What do you focus on the most in the story of the St. John's Bible?
When I talk about the story, I will talk about the fact that I focus on 5 words: quality, longevity, forward thinking, and community. 4 words, excuse me. Quality, longevity, forward thinking, and community. Almost always everything I do is about those 4 words. So quality, so then we get into how this thing was made, the tools, the materials, the ancient methodologies. Now it's different with the Heritage Edition. You're going to talk about how the Heritage Edition was done at a high quality to mimic the original, which was done this way. Make sure that's clear, very clear, that what you have in front of you is not the real thing, but it's the next best thing to the real thing. Quality, longevity, you can get into the idea of the tools again and the materials and how the paper on the book is designed to last forever. But the longevity of the artwork itself, how these are not tied to now. They're not tied to saying this is didactic. There's nothing about the St. John's Bible that is meant to be didactic. By that I mean, it may mean something today, but it will mean something different tomorrow. This is not about telling you what the life and community story was about. This is not about telling you what the creation story is about. This is about inviting you into the conversation and weaving through that element of forward thinking. So you take a look at the creation story and how the end gold bars actually fall off the artwork, telling you that creation is not done, that there's more to come. When you take a look at the prophetic nature of the word in several illuminations that have things that are dealing with today, but they'll also have meaning 500 years from now. So that idea of forward thinking. And the most important thing, the idea that the word is communal. And so rather than saying, okay, I have to have my audience learn about the quills, the inks, Donald Jackson, and all this. No, I want them to come away with the idea that this is a quality project that was done with a long view in mind, that is about reinforcing the communal nature of the word. And boy, I cannot wait to drag somebody else over here and show them to have the same experience I had. Then that becomes transformational. And it's so unimportant to know all the physical details. It's fascinating, and the minutia people love, but that's not what's going to keep it around. It's the fact that people can relate to it, can engage with it, and they can make it their own. That will give this thing legs over centuries.
Thanks, Tim. This question's from Stephanie Plowman from Gonzaga. Thank you for the YouTube video. You talked a bit about it earlier, but if an institution owns a heritage edition, how can we share the volumes? This is like the special collections worst fear, right? How do we share the volumes without harming them?
Yeah. Well, again, as anytime when a group comes to my place or a rare book collection, I simply show them how to engage with it. I don't just put it on the table and say, here, let you go at it. But I talk to them and I say, you know, we need to watch your zippers. Please take your coats off because your zippers could get caught. We're going to have you wash your hands. We want you to touch this. We're going to have you wash your hands and explain why. So yeah, I just go over the protocol with them. And I have never, in all the 17 years I've been working with this, I've never had somebody purposefully break that rule. They have been very respectful of it. First of all, they see this big, beautiful thing, and that immediately, in our world, says we go like this and we step back a little bit. The thing itself tells you it should be carefully handled. But I simply go over that. I never show a volume without first talking about how we want to take care of this. But I also don't do it in a way that it terrifies them and say, oh, we can't touch it. And I reinforce the fact that this is made to be handled, but we're going to handle it carefully so that the next person can handle it, and in 10 years they can handle it, and so on and so on. And in our collection, we have 15,000 rare books and manuscripts at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Many of them are 600, 700, 800 years old, and they were not in a museum for 700 years. They were used. They were pulled off the shelf. They were opened. They were looked at. They probably even had bookmarkers put into them. They were not in air conditioning. They did not have climate control. They did not have heating. They did not have humidity. And they are as beautiful today as they were centuries ago. They were cared for. They were taken care of, but they were used. And we need to remember that. These books are made to be used, but carefully.
Tim, I have a question, and that is, there are certain illuminations that are iconic images in the St. John's Bible. There's the creation scene and the birth of Christ, and I think we're all quite familiar with them. And I think you do a pretty good job in your presentation encouraging people to be more exploratory in terms of how they go through the volumes. What are the other illuminations that are particularly rich for group discussions that may be, for lack of a better word, underappreciated? Ones that maybe we can encourage, especially the folks out there that have the heritage, and get them to maybe pay more attention to than just the creation scene or just the Matthew frontispiece and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of a good kind of transition into.
No, go ahead.
I always have to re-click here. There we go. Some timely topics as we look at this. People, it's so easy to get stuck on an illumination. I do it myself. If I'm going to do a big audience, I almost always do the creation story because it's such an easy thing to talk about when you have 500, 600 people in front of you, or even 30 people in front of you. And you can use it if you are in a Christian community, an Islamic community, a Jewish community, a Native American community, or whatever community you may happen to be talking to, because creation stories are universal. But there's we hear the idea of the living word, and we need to remember that the stories and passages can really talk to our time period, and we can engage with them in a timely manner. One that is surprisingly always ignored is this one. It happens to be one of my absolute favorite ones to talk about, and it's very timely right now when you take a look at this particular artwork. This is the Confession of Peter. Upon this rock, I want you to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail. And if you zoom in, you can see it here. And look at how I have my screen laid out. For those of you who are doing online presentations, I have my screens laid out so that they are left justified. so that many people then can take and put their video screen over here in the corner, and the video screen will not get in the way of anything that's over here that I'm talking about, just as a bit of, so you'll see all my PowerPoints are almost always left justified, but I'm going to do them online like this for this little video screen that's up here in the corner. Anyway, back to Confession of Peter. This is a great one because it's very timely. So we have, upon this rock, I want you to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail. You've got the wonderful warm side here of Peter's confession, where you see the face of Christ in the rock of the church, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the scaffolding being built. And you have the image of Christ personified standing in the middle. And then you have the image of hell, basically. Christ at the gates of Hades shall not prevail. The word Sheol here in Hebrew. And you've got then these images of polytheism all around it. Now, what makes this so interesting at this point in time is, in the St. John's Bible, the theologians talked about, what do we do with this concept of hell? Who do we place in hell? That kind of idea. Because if you look at old ancient pictures of hell, they had pictures of people in hell burning in flames, and you knew who belonged in hell and you knew who was going to hell. Well, that kind of conversation doesn't really do well in the modern world. And so when the conversation at St. John's took place, they talked about the experience of hell and going through hell and what was a hell-like experience. And what their conversation ended up with is this image right here. And you can see these images of polytheism surrounding this interesting area here. And as I've talked with this, and I've done this one several times during all of this, I asked people, in this image of hell, a hell-like experience, what does this look like? And of course, it is a virus. Yeah. It is a virus that's causing here. Imagine having this virus. Maybe it's Zika, maybe it's Ebola, maybe it's coronavirus, maybe it's AIDS. But imagine the experience of having this virus. What does it feel like? Isolation, withdrawal, removal from society. Think of how society treats you and points the fingers, especially in the early days of AIDS. If someone has AIDS, it was their fault. They were a bad person. That was a hell-like experience for those people. Or as one woman in a conversation a few weeks ago, she said she looked at this and she said, no, that virus is hate, because hate spreads just like that. And so imagine having those conversations in now. And I always love this because look over here. This was made in 2002. That whole concept of the living words, these things do have relevance in today's world and society. This is one that is often always ignored when people look at it as well. And of course, this is a great one for conversations right now. And again, you can cover up part of it and look at the top. But in this one, people often look at down here and they look at this death and destruction, but they don't see, of course, the balance of gold that's up here in light. And many people ignore the fact that even in the terrible things we do to each other, there are tiny bits of gold spattered among the darkness as well. Great conversation. Likewise, the four horsemen of the apocalypse is one that's commonly talked about, but often talked about in terms of the darkness and the destruction. People love showing all the cannons and the oil rigs and the cancer cells, which are right here, and the AIDS virus and leprosy virus. But they ignore the fact that surrounding all this death and destruction, all this darkness, we have these beautiful golden, beautiful colors of the rainbow and tiny bits of gold. The book of Revelation is a book of hope, because contrasting it with this one at the end, the vision of the New Jerusalem, you have this powerful vision of what the future holds, and it's golden and light, and it's, again, hope. Hope in the midst of the darkness that many people are dealing with right now. One book that gets so little attention from people is historical books, and it is a rich opportunity for discussion. The Joshua Anthology opens historical books with this very powerful artwork that talks about, you know, the leaving of Egypt and going off to the promised land and taking with them the law of the land. You see fragments of the 10 Commandments here. And this particular artwork introduces so many motifs and ideas that can lead to a great and very timely discussion that you could have right now. But many people look at this and they move forward on it. But if you take a look at this one, Donald Jackson and the committee introduced visual elements here that come from Egyptian tombs and Egyptian visual motifs, and they use those as elements of strength. And I'm not going to go into detail about this because you can read about this in some of the resources if you want to, but beginning a conversation here, and you can track it all the way through the first part of Joshua and Judges, and you can see all these elements are still used, all these Egyptian motifs in the city in flames and the death of Jephthah's daughter and the life of Samson over here, even in the letters and so on, and the frames that go around all the way through. And you can talk about all those elements in there, but then you can bring it into the modern world by focusing on an element in the Judges anthology with these words. Take a look at those words. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And I often do this when I'm sharing an image from the St. John's Bible. I will pull out a phrase that was very key to the artwork, a phrase that was is very key to that scripture passage for creation in the beginning. We spend 20 minutes talking about the words in the beginning and what does that mean to us. In this case, all the people did what was right in their own eyes. Imagine having that conversation about the power of those words and what those words mean in the context that we're living within right now. And then you unveil that artwork and it shows you the destruction and the chaos and the visual cacophony that happens as everyone does only what they see as fitting in their own mind, and the mess and disaster that this brings through. And you can see now all these very strong elements from the Egyptian tombs that were used to show power and strength are now crumbling, collapsing, and falling down to chaos and disorder in their own destructive ways. So taking artworks that are historical, that are part of the tradition that of visual storytelling, and seeing that they still have storytelling and apply to today is very, very, very powerful in your conversations as well. So in terms of volumes that don't get much attention, historical books. Dig that out. There's some powerful stuff in there. The Prophets, in my mind, is one of the strongest volumes in the entire collection. The Vision of Isaiah, the Messianic predictions, the unpacking of the temple that's paired with the vision at Kabar. Those are powerful visual stories that allow you to unpack. And because people are not as familiar with the stories, it allows you to introduce new sections of the Bible, but it also allows you to have them unpack them in different ways. And they're going to be less worried about saying, oh, it's the creation story. I've got to remember the creation story. I've got to get the details right. No, freeing them from talking about what they think it should be as to what they actually see is very powerful.
Thanks, Tim. I think one of the interesting sort of historical aspects of the St. John's Bible is the fact that the donors who made the St. John's Bible possible actually come from a wide range. If you look at sort of political spectrums,
Yep.
wide range, very conservative, very progressive. If you look at the institutions, it actually mirrors that to a large degree. There are some very conservative institutions and some much more progressive institutions. Have you ever, I've had it happen maybe a few times, but have you had a situation with an audience where it does get a little maybe uncomfortably political? And how did you deal with that? Actually,
I've not had any uncomfortable political discussions because you have to frame it in a way that allows that voice to be heard. But just to go back for a quick second, the St. John's Bible is one of the very few things in the world of religion where I have encountered that people who are very conservative and people who are very liberal both agree on and enjoy and find a lot of things to talk about. And it's not even middle of the ground. It's very interesting how this really crosses traditions and beliefs. In all my conversations, I have had some people not happy with the way Adam and Eve look, which I just kind of think is very smiling and very telling. I have had some people not happy with the translation. And in fact, one person said, well, it's not the King James, and so I wouldn't dare read this. And I said, well, this is not the King James because number one, we're Catholic and we wouldn't use that translation, but we chose the translation because it is one of the most widely accepted translations in English. Now, that being said, doesn't mean that we can't replace some of the words in here with the King James and still look at the creation story. And so I kind of couch things that way. I've never had an argument during a presentation with someone. I have had people say to me, well, that's not right. And anytime someone says something, I don't ever ask them, or I don't ever say, well, here's why it's right. I don't ever say, well, you're wrong, but I will simply say, well, why do you think it's not right? I will always put it back onto them, because your job is, as a facilitator, is not to participate in the conversation, is to participate in the conversation as little as possible and draw them out and listen to what they have to say. And then I will simply use techniques. Well, you know, this person just said that. What does anybody else think about that? And we can have a conversation in which it can be listening, can be productive. And then if it gets testy, I say, well, you know, that's the beauty of this, that, you know, we are allowed to have different opinions, and the communal nature of it is what encourages that. If this was not to be communal, you can't have community without discussion, and we can't go anywhere without that. And so I always draw it back to that communal nature of the word and the communal experience. That's my experience. People might have different techniques that they've done, right, but I always turn it back to the
Now, on a lighter note, and you sort of touched on this in the presentation. On a lighter note, you know, we've all been in situations where there's someone who's dominating conversation, and you touched on it, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about strategies for that, because when someone dominates, other people tend to be quiet then. So
exactly, I go back to that list I gave you at the very beginning. If I have a conversation that's someone's dominating the conversation, I will simply say, okay, I'm going to quiet the conversation now and ask you to do the following. I'll quickly change what's on the screen, or maybe change the direction. I'll say, okay, look at this, and I'll answer a question. What do you see? However I phrase it, or what's going on here. And I don't want you to talk to anybody. Just stand here for 30 seconds and look. Everyone look at the artwork or whatever you're looking at, the page, and think. So that's the first step, think. Turn to the person next to you, pair, and share it. And so think, pair, share. Very quick technique that you can use to redirect anything at all. So someone's dominating, I'll quiet the audience down and say, all right, everyone look at this, think about this, turn to the person next to you and talk about it. And then your job during that time is to go through and listen to what people are saying. And when it's time to reopen the conversation, you may have told someone ahead of time, you may have tapped on the shoulder and said, that was a great comment. I'm going to ask you to repeat that to the whole audience in a few seconds. Or you may just listen and call on someone and say, now, let's hear what the conversation was like. Over here, you were talking about this. Would you mind having that? Would you mind sharing what you talked about? So you take immediately control back of that audience and you redirect that conversation. If it continues to happen, I have no problem going and saying, wow, you know, we've got so many voices in here, but we're hearing from so few of them. So I'm going to ask those who have been doing a lot of sharing to not talk for a few minutes and let others talk as well. There's nothing wrong with that as well. You have to do it in a way, of course, that's not going to be insulting or pointing a finger. And I have asked someone, I have gone to someone in a conversation and just saying, boy, you know, I'm really impressed with what you have to say. But because of your expertise, you are really kind of overshadowing some people. Do you mind just holding back a little bit on some of your conversations? I don't say it publicly. I'll give the audience something to do, something to talk about, and I'll go bop over to that person and talk to that person individually. And it's always worked. You just have to find ways to do it. And go back to that list I gave you, change the conversation by changing the direction, asking people to retitle, but getting rid of the group conversation and going into a paired conversation where there's some more chatting going around you is a very powerful tool. And you can do it with an audience of 10 to an audience of 5,000.
Great. I think we're getting close to the end here. Tim, was there any other items you wanted to cover? Or I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about here at the end, but I don't want to cut into your time. What I wanted to do was, right before we went live with this webinar, Tim and I were having a conversation, and Tim had a really good suggestion. And the suggestion is, okay, when we originally titled this, by the way, I think we used the term best practices, and this is my confession here. I'm going to confession. Tim brought up the fact that this is not really best practices. This is really his practice. This is how he feels the best way to share the Bible. But there are lots of other practices out there that are just as valid. And so, to that point,
right. Yep.
Tim's suggestion earlier is, I think what we'd like to do is do another version of this same sort of general topic, but create a panel discussion. And especially for some of our partners out there, I'd love to, for those of you that would like to volunteer for this, I'd like to maybe create a panel, because we'd like to hear your best practices, maybe ones that we didn't talk about here that really work for you, whether it be in a church setting or a university setting or a library or a hospital or whatever. So I'd like to invite some input here. I'd also like to invite some input on future editions of the Illuminate series. We have an outline in mind. You're going to hear about the next series in the early part of October. So more information will be coming. Please make sure you're subscribed to the Scribe, our blog, because that's how we get the news out on these things. But we'd like to invite your participation in this so that we're all sharing different ways in which we're doing it. There's no, as Tim says, there's not any one way to do it, and we'd like to invite your input. So maybe you can send me an email or call me. I think you all have my contact information. Really do appreciate. One last question from Jenny Parker. Can you please talk a bit about the appropriate use of the images in the PowerPoints? I was under the impression that the availability of them is narrow, and I was surprised to learn that viewers could take photos with their phone as long as they credit the St. John's Bible. Let me just talk a little bit, Tim. I'm gonna, because Tim is he's been the manager of this for many years. The people that have the Heritage Edition can use the images, but they do have to give the credits. People that don't have the Heritage Edition, maybe Tim, can you weigh in on that?
Sure. If you are working with images or if you're doing a presentation and you want images, you can contact me. And if you're not going to sell them, if you're not going to put them in a published book, if you're not going to make posters of them, or you're not going to make t-shirts out of them, you're going to use them in education, presentations, and discussions, we're happy to share images with you. If you take a look at how I did everything, there wasn't a single slide you saw up here that did not have the credit line, the full credit line. And that's what we ask you to do. We simply ask you to remember that the artists are to be credited and shared. You also saw several times where I had details, okay? And if I had a detail, sometimes I used the word detail, sometimes I didn't. But they're always credited all the way through. You can contact me and I'll be happy to work with you on images. We do not make every single image available. That's 1,100 images. And we also do not give you the highest resolution. We give you very good resolution that you can use and work with. And I'm happy to do that, to work with you on that individually.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for participating. We're excited by the great response to this. We really weren't sure how big a response it was going to be. Really do appreciate your time. Again, this was recorded. It's going to be available if you need a link to it. I think the way it works is that Zoom will actually keep it online for about 30 days, and then we'll make it available later as well. And as obviously the YouTube presentation is available to you all. And really do appreciate your participation, but also encourage your feedback. And if you have ideas for future series, we'd love to hear them. We are not traveling anywhere. We are sequestered here in Collegeville to a large degree. And so we really want to leverage our virtual world as much as possible so that we keep the energy behind the St. John's Bible. Just so you all know, and I think I might have mentioned it in some email communications, there's about 150 locations now around the world that have the Heritage Edition. Obviously many more than that have the Trade Edition. And so we're excited about this community that's been built, and we want to make sure we're doing our part to keep you all together and keep sharing these great ideas. So thank you. Tim, did you have any final thoughts?
Just, I would love to hear from people to say what you do that is really effective, because I'm always building an arsenal of questions and techniques and methods, and I'd love to hear from you as well. And you can find my contact information on the Bible website or through Jim.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend coming up. And again, thank you so much for participating. Have a good day. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone.